A warm welcome to Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. This week we turn our attention to Sudan, where the military has taken over, saying they had to prevent the country from a civil war. The international community has not taken kindly to the truncating of another democratic government in Africa and has sounded warnings and threats of what could happen, especially for Sudan, which has only just begun experiencing again what democratic governance is all about. Activists and citizens planned protests on Saturday turned awry as we hear security forces fired live rounds and tear gas, killing some protesters. I'll be speaking to the African Union's Commissioner for Political Affairs and Peace and Security, Ambassador Bankole Adeoye, on the AU's response to the situation in Sudan. Later in the program, COP26 began this weekend as leaders attended the first meetings that proved crucial to saving our planet. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. First, a quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles. We'll be right back. The European Union has donated 192 million naira to combat cholera in Yobe state in Nigeria. This was made known in a statement released by the EU, which says, in response to the cholera outbreak affecting Nigeria, the EU is supporting medical humanitarian NGO Alliance for International Medical Action, ALIMA's ongoing efforts to reduce fatality in Yobe State with 192 million naira. The statement said that as of September 26, 2021, over 88,563 suspected cases of cholera and 3,057 suspected deaths were reported in Nigeria, and that 78% of states in the country have reported suspected cholera cases. A U.S. government exchange alumni-led project, Girls Creativity Hub, has completed a 12-month-long entrepreneurship program for 100 out-of-school girls and young women. Aged 18 to 25, the participants received training and mentoring in areas of creative design, entrepreneurship and leadership skills, with the overall goal of establishing economic independence. Through sessions led by a local team of trainers, the 100 participants explored the basics of entrepreneurship, received guidance on how to register a small business, delved into finance and cost management, expanded their sales and marketing abilities. Meanwhile, beginning November 8, 2021, foreign national air travelers to the United States will be required, with only limited exceptions, to be fully vaccinated and to provide proof of vaccination status prior to boarding an airplane to fly to the United States. The new global travel system replaces the existing country-by-country restrictions, putting in place a consistent approach worldwide. However, fully vaccinated air travelers will continue to be required to show documentation of a pre-departure negative viral test taken within 3 calendar days of travel to the United States before boarding. That includes all travelers, U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and foreign nationals. Welcome back. The Nigerian government has condemned the coup in Sudan and called for the restoration of democratic order. So have other global leaders, but all that has fallen on deaf ears. A coup's leader, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, says he dissolved the country's government to avoid a civil war, as the army had no choice but to sideline politicians who were inciting against the armed forces. While he has no faith in the civilian government, he says he will appoint a technocrat prime minister to rule alongside the military within days.
It has been a week since the coup in Sudan, and one thing is clear: the military has come to stay. Coup leader and the military's top general, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, said during the week the military was saving the country from a civil war. Monday's coup toppled the government of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, who was kidnapped and taken to an unknown location. He was later said to have been in the home of General al-Burhan and was safe. Upon his release and return back home, he was visited by members of the diplomatic corps. This after leaders around the world had called for his release and that of other civilians held by the military, and for the government to be restored. General Al-Burhan now says the new prime minister to be appointed by the military will form a cabinet that will share the leadership of the country with the armed forces. Meanwhile, protests against the military takeover have continued, especially in the capital Khartoum on Saturday. Tens of thousands of people marched through the streets calling for restoration of civilian rule. They carried Sudanese flags and chanted military rule can't be praised, and this country is ours and our government is civilian, as they marched in neighborhoods in Khartoum. Security forces blocked roads leading to the Defense Ministry complex and the airport, as well as most of the bridges connecting Khartoum with the twin cities of Omdurman and Khartoum North. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has assailed what he calls an epidemic of coup d'etats and urged the Security Council to act effectively to deter them. The Security Council, which has the ability to impose sanctions or authorize military action, has been split on how to approach various conflicts, with the United States and other Western Council members pitted against Russia and China.
Now, we are seeing a multiplication of coup d'etats. The fact that we have strong geopolitical divides, the fact that the Security Council has lots of difficulties in taking strong measures, the impact of the problems of COVID and the difficulties that many countries face from the economic and social point of view, these three factors are creating an environment in which some military leaders feel that they have total impunity, they can do whatever they want, because nothing will happen to them. And my appeal, obviously, is for especially the big powers to come together for the unity of the Security Council in order to make sure that there is effective deterrence in relation to this epidemic of coup d'etats. And we have seen that effective deterrence today is not in place. We have seen it in Myanmar, and we have also seen it in several African locations.
In addition to the international condemnation for the coup, where calls for the release of Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok, whose whereabouts were unknown in the first 48 hours of the coup, the U.S. announced it was halting $700 million in economic support for Sudan.
In light of these developments, the United States is pausing assistance from the $700 million in emergency assistance appropriations of economic support funds for Sudan. Those funds were intended to support the country's democratic transition as we evaluate the next step for Sudan programming.
Alongside Western states freezing aid to Sudan, the World Bank last week announced it had suspended aid to Sudan. The sudden cut is likely to have dire consequences for the country's battered economy. At a time when it was just starting to get back to its feet, the World Bank has contributed some $3 billion in aid to Sudan to support agriculture, transport, healthcare and education, amongst other things. The African Union has also suspended Sudan from the bloc over the unconstitutional seizure of power. Apart from street demonstrations, a civil strike is ongoing. Many local businesses, including pharmacies, telecom operators, and schools, are shut.
I want to bring in now the AU Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security, Ambassador Bankole Adeoye. He joins me now from Nairobi, Kenya. Ambassador Adeoye, thank you for joining me on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
The coup in Sudan is the third to occur in Africa within a year. What is the African Union doing to stem the tide of toppled governments in Africa?
The resurgence of military takeover is very regrettable. And the African Union continues to stand ready and firm based on its institutional and normative instruments. As you are aware, the African Union has zero tolerance for military takeover. And it is one of the most important instruments based on its Constitutive Act, its African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council itself, and of course, the Lome Declaration. These normative instruments have been activated for the cases of Mali, for Guinea, and now, most recently, Sudan. And that is why the three countries in question have been suspended by the Peace and Security Council, which is the decision-making organ on peace and security. The African Union stands ready to continue to work with international partners, with the regional economic communities in the case of Sudan, IGAD, to make sure that civilian-led transition is restored without further delay. But we must continue to push and pressurize the military leaders, the new authorities in Khartoum, to see the most important way of finding a lasting solution to the recurrence of military takeover in the Sudan or in any of our member states. But you must be assured that African Union member states, totally without exception, continue to push and condemn very strongly any unconstitutional changes of government. The era of military dictatorship is over on the African continent, and it is a new Africa that we want. The Africa that we want, based on Agenda 2063, must be activated by all democracy-loving, peace-loving member states of the Union.
So, you say this and it sounds really convincing, but you've had 3 coups in 1 year. And then you talk about pushing on Sudan to restore a democratic governance. Does that include negotiating with the coup leader, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan?
I will not call it negotiation, but rather consultation. The member states in question, Sudan, Mali, as well as Guinea, have been suspended. And indeed, the Peace and Security Council is also mandated by its protocol to consider, when necessary, targeted punitive sanctions, which could include many other areas of sanctions. But what is necessary is that consultations are ongoing with every stakeholder, knowing fully well that we must continue to protect the rights of all Sudanese, their rights to protect, their right to free assembly, their right and their hunger for democracy. We must also know that we are also consulting with the United Nations, with IGAD, the regional economic community involved, and all other stakeholders, knowing fully well that the pressure must be placed on the Sudanese military to maintain the current constitutional declaration, which the African Union was the main architect in 2019 when the first coup happened following the overthrow of then President Omar Bashir. So today, the African Union, through the Peace and Security Council, the Commission, the chairperson of the Commission, have continued to emphasize consultations and dialogue to make sure that the military leaders in Sudan abide by the agreement signed in 2019, including that signed in 2020, the Juba Agreement. These instruments have established what you can call a political cohabitation system, where the Sovereign Council, made up of mainly military leaders, as well as the Prime Minister, leading the Civilian Transitional Authority.
We'll take a short break. My conversation with Ambassador Bankole Adeoye continues shortly. Stay with us. Just last week, the ECOWAS representative in Mali was kicked out because the military said it was involved, in activities not fitting his position. And does the AU have a representative in Mali and in Guinea helping with negotiations, or, as you say, the talks behind the scenes, or is the union also leaving that to ECOWAS to handle?
It's a collective work, but the AU definitely as a high representative, what is called the special representative of the chairperson of the commission based in Bamako, in Mali, and at the headship of the AU mission to the Sahel. And that means working closely with the government of Mali, as well as with all stakeholders, women, youth groups, and of course, ECOWAS, particularly former President Goodluck Jonathan, who is the mediator, special envoy of ECOWAS for Mali. We are all in this together as stakeholders at intergovernmental level and national, regional leaders, knowing fully well that we have to continue to make sure that the specter of military takeover does not become the norm. The continent is already convinced, the youth are convinced about the freedom they enjoy, the fundamental freedoms that come with democracy, and the military will not take this over from us at this time. And this is why the African Union, through the Peace and Security Council, as well as all the Commission as well, is committed that we have to push and retain our zero tolerance for unconstitutional changes of government.
Weeks ago, the African Union appointed a former Nigerian President, Olusegun Obasanjo, as special envoy to Ethiopia. At the last we heard, he was consulting with international partners. Is there any progress regarding his mission in the country? As you know, there's been fighting in the Tigray region in recent days, and they may be worsening. The Ethiopian army is conducting regular airstrikes on the capital, Mekele.
The Horn of Africa is one region that the AU system, AU-wide system, has been concerned with. From terrorism to violent extremism, the ideology of hate, long-running civil war, human trafficking, climate security issues. And this is why, in its wisdom, the chairperson of the commission, His Excellency Musa Faki Mahamat, appointed former President Olusegun Obasanjo as High Representative for the region. This is the first time in a long time in the history of the African Union that a former leader has been appointed to cover a region. And that shows that the African Union believes in his experience, in his wisdom, and his reach. And I believe this is what he has started to do. And just last week, the Peace and Security Council held a session and reviewed his inception report. He has started consultations in the region, particularly with the leaders in Ethiopia, the stakeholders in Sudan and Djibouti. And we believe that he will be also in the nearest future be engaging with leaders in the region. The most important factor that I will see in his appointment is that African solutions to African problems must be the centerpiece of his engagements. And of course, in partnership with the international actors, those with interests in the region and beyond, it is necessary that we see progress being made on a steady basis.
You know that the AU has come under heavy criticism recently. A lot of people are saying that the AU appears helpless when it comes to political crisis on the continent. What is your response to this criticism?
Absolutely not. The AU remains seized of these matters. The AU stands ready to continue to work with the international community, with its member states, with its regional blocs, to ensure that peace, security, stability, premised on democracy, multi-party democracy, good governance will become the order of the day. It is necessary that we see that the AU remains a union, not only of governments, but a union of people. And that is why the AU cannot stand helplessly watching this events unfold. We are working with partners day and night, 24/7, to make sure that we return to the democratic norms that the wave we saw in the beginning of the new millennium. And this is why the African Union stands ready. Our Department, Political Affairs, Peace and Security, is continuing to work with all stakeholders in order to make sure that peace reigns. And of course, we see effective governance that will lead to peace dividends in the long term.
But are you seeing the results? You know, there's partnerships and these negotiations going on. Are you seeing the results?
The results are trickling in. And I want to assure you that the political transition in many of these countries, in Guinea, in Mali, in Sudan, in Gambia, the elections that we see, that we have witnessed, that we have monitored and observed, show that the youth remain the center for the change, the change that we are inspiring on the continent. And that change is not just a holistic work to be done by the African Union. It is collective. It is universal. And with the technology that we see, the robustness of our leaders, and the normative frameworks that we need to activate and implement without delay, I believe there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Well, Ambassador Adeoye, we'll have to take your words to task and revisit these issues later because there will be developments. Thank you again for speaking with me on Diplomatic Channel.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Leaders of the world's richest economies began meetings over the weekend to try to reach a meaningful deal on preventing climate change. As follows the G20 meetings on Saturday, in which they agreed on a global tax rate to see profits of large businesses taxed at least 15%, following concern that multinational companies are rerouting their profits through low-tax jurisdictions.
Leaders of the world's richest economies have agreed to pursue efforts to limit global warming with what they describe as meaningful and effective actions. But the draft agreement from the G20 summit in Rome made few concrete commitments, disappointing activists. Italy, the host nation, had hoped that firm targets would be set before the COP26 summit in Glasgow. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said leaders' promises without action were starting to sound hollow.
The countries most responsible for historic and present-day emissions are not yet doing their fair share of the work. If we are going to prevent COP26 from being a failure, then that must change. And I must be clear that if Glasgow fails, then the whole thing fails. The Paris Agreement will have crumpled at the first reckoning.
The G20 group, made up of 19 countries and the European Union, accounts for 80% of the world's emissions. Communique released by the leaders also makes no reference to achieving net zero by 2050. Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, however, did say in his closing statement that all of the G20 countries are committed to reaching the target by the mid-century. Scientists say this must be achieved by 2050 to avoid a climate catastrophe, and most countries have agreed to this.
Moreover, all G20 countries will commit to net zero emissions by mid-century. And we've moved much closer to the goal of reaching the $100 billion in climate finance to support vulnerable countries. We are now quite close, and as President Macron said, we can use the SDR allocations to fill any remaining gap. I'm glad to announce that Italy will nearly triple its finance commitment to $1.4 billion a year for the next 5 years to this effort.
On the sidelines of the summit, Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi called for regular communication between China and the United States and urged the United States to stay committed to its one China policy rather than saying one thing but doing quite another. The US and EU also agreed to end the festering dispute over US steel and aluminum tariff imposed by former President Donald Trump in 2018. US President Joe Biden said the deal immediately removes tariffs on the European Union steel and aluminum imposed by the previous administration and lowers costs to US consumers. Finally, French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson agreed to try to de-escalate a row over post-Brexit fishing rights. The leaders, who have given conflicting signals over whether they wanted to turn down the heat in the dispute, used a private meeting to try to ease tensions. According to a French official, President Macron told Mr. Johnson that Britain should obey the rules, which Paris accused it of flouting by failing to give France enough fishing licenses to operate in British waters. Britain says it is meeting the conditions of the post-Brexit trade agreement.
This is where we end the program this week. Thank you for joining me. Don't forget, you can watch this episode and others on our website or on YouTube. Head on to channelstv.com, go to programs and search for Diplomatic Channel, or go to youtube.com/channelsweb. Look for the playlist and search for Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Thanks for watching.